As the Cold War neared its end in the late 1980s, the satellite states of Eastern Europe, long dominated by the Soviet Union, began to pull away from Moscow's grip. For decades, the threat of Soviet military intervention had kept communist governments in power across the region, but under Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership, that fear began to fade. Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, openness, encouraged greater freedom of expression and reform across the Soviet bloc, and his decision to abandon the Brezhnev Doctrine signaled that the USSR would no longer use force to maintain control over its satellite states. This shift emboldened opposition movements across Eastern Europe, sparking a wave of political change. The most iconic symbol of this shift was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. For nearly 3 decades, the Berlin Wall had divided East and West Berlin, standing as a physical and ideological barrier between communist East Germany and the democratic West. As protests mounted in East Germany, with citizens demanding reforms and greater freedoms, the government found itself unable to suppress the movement. On November 9, 1989, in a moment of confusion and desperation, the East German authorities opened the border and jubilant crowds tore down the wall. The collapse of this divisive structure became the defining moment of Eastern Europe's rejection of Soviet domination. As the Berlin Wall fell, communist governments across Eastern Europe began to collapse. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Wałęsa, had already gained significant momentum, forcing the government to hold free elections in June 1989, leading to a peaceful transfer of power. In Hungary, the communist regime opened its border with Austria, setting off a chain reaction as East Germans began fleeing to the west. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution in late 1989 saw massive protests and strikes, culminating in the peaceful ousting of the communist regime. Similar uprisings occurred in Bulgaria and Romania, although the Romanian Revolution was marked by violence, with the execution of dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. As Eastern Europe broke away from Soviet control, the disintegration spread to the republics within the USSR itself. Gorbachev's reforms had unintentionally weakened the central authority of the Soviet Union, and the republics, long suppressed under Soviet rule, began to assert their desire for independence. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were among the first to demand sovereignty, with their independence movements gaining strength in 1990. Soon republics like Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia followed suit, pushing for greater autonomy or outright independence. Ethnic tensions and nationalist movements flared across the USSR, challenging Moscow's ability to maintain control. By 1991, the Soviet Union was unraveling. The central government could no longer suppress the growing desire for independence among its republics, and the failed coup by hardline communists in August of that year only hastened the collapse. One by one, the Soviet republics declared independence, and by the end of the year, the Soviet Union itself had officially dissolved, bringing an end to the Cold War. The events of 1989 and 91 marked the dramatic collapse of Soviet power in Eastern Europe and within the USSR. What began as a weakening of Soviet influence quickly escalated into a full-scale rejection of communist rule, as the satellite states and Soviet republics seized the moment to assert their independence, bringing about the end of an era.